Hello, and thank you for coming along this afternoon. Today we're going to look at historical cartography in the digital age, looking specifically at imaging Senegal the last 500 years, with new technologies, new communities, and new questions. Basically, historical cartography in Africa has taken off in a new way because of new technologies, new communities, and new questions. Maps have been around for hundreds of years, and we're just beginning to realize how best to share them and work collectively on them in groups of people that have never before met, raising new kinds of questions in reference to the maps themselves. We're doing this through a group over at Boston University and through specialized library collections like Afroterra and groups like the Africa Map Circle. We'll give an example of how this can be done in reference to imaging Senegal in historical cartography. First, we'll go through a brief consideration of new technologies, new communities, and the new kinds of questions that can be asked in both African and world history, with the use, especially, of map chats, both for teaching and extended international collaborative research on multiple aspects of global history, not just African history, but a new kind of global history. African historical cartography has benefited in recent years from the digitization revolution, in effect, the ability to digitize up to resolutions of 600 dots per inch or even more of maps that have been very old and very delicate and very hard to handle. This has led to new kinds of communities grouped around these new maps, looking at narratives that can be put together with new understandings of what's been happening. The new technologies are not all that obscure. They have to do with individual institutions digitizing for conservation and preservation purposes their own collections over time of maps, prints, photos, documents of any kind. These can be digitized, as we've said, at 600 dots per inch and now shared as digital files. This can be combined with other digital assets like Google Earth to locate these maps sort of geologically on the surface of the Earth and give us a sense of how they can evolve over time. Universities are doing these things. Museums are digitizing their collections for reasons of conservation and preservation on their own, and they're beginning to develop consortia to share the digitization of different assets that they have in their collections, many before never really studied in detail. These things can be combined with public access community television. Throughout any part of the United States that has cable television, cable companies, in order to get a license to operate in any local operation, need to, in fact, to provide the community with television facilities to be used by citizens of that town or city. These are variously used, and some of them have been used quite creatively, to devise programs that can now be presented not only on the local community access television, but they can be preserved and shared beyond the location of the particular studio within that community through things like YouTube and MP4 files that can be sent around the world and linked through computer links available on any web browser. Further, we can develop QR codes that provide instant access for anyone trying to get to the reference material behind this kind of technology. QR codes are something that teenagers know how to use. Their parents need to be introduced to it in some sense. And it's a good example of how educational and museums and universities have to catch up with what teenagers already know. You don't have to teach a teenager how to use a cell phone. They seem to learn it very quickly, and once they've learned it, they can get access through scanning in QR codes to information never previously possible, even in the most specialized of circles. So what's potential here is enormous. The addition and the cumulative use of these kinds of different technologies have created entirely new communities asking new kinds of questions. The question remaining is, will these be realized? Yes, the potential is there, but it needs the new communities to, in effect, draw upon the potential and present these new narratives to one another for scrutiny, sharing, learning, international understanding. Some tools that have been elaborated recently have been elaborated specifically during the global lockdown because of the pandemic on a global scale. One of these is a thing called the map chat. Map chat is very interesting as a proposition because, once again, it's not new technology. It's a new application of the technology and the creation of digital hand lists. So we're going to consider both of those things briefly here, the map chat and the digital hand list. Now, hand lists are as old as libraries that go back as far as anyone has ever kept books or writing of any kind. A hand list is a guide to the material in a library. Now, if the library is digital, then the hand list can become digital and can point to digital objects. This is exactly what's happened, and so it's an application of an old habit, as it were, of librarians creating hand lists and catalogs to a new environment, a digitized one, particularly to facilitate the map chat. The map chat is somewhat new as an idea, but in effect, it's an electronic version of the old classroom, whether it's a lecture classroom or a seminar or a colloquium or a conference. All of these things are kinds of map chats that can focus on a particular range of different maps, a particular map and different conversations about different aspects of the same map, or comparative map studies. For example, comparative colonial cartography, looking at maps from widely different parts of the world that deal with similar problems, colonial frontiers, the expansion of technology, and things like this. So let's look briefly at this. There is, as I say, nothing particularly new here. Map chats are, in a sense, an electronic version of the old lecture or the presentation. Online presentations are now frequently done in high school or even younger levels as we've had to deal with lockdown. Technologies like Zoom have made it possible to communicate over long distances, and students can pick up on lectures, talks, introductions by anyone. The particular form here of map chat is an interesting way to engage students, scholars, and researchers of all types into the importance of historical maps previously only available to those in the institutions that owned them and preserved them in their rarefied libraries. So the two things, map chats and hand lists, are not new, but they have been used in a new way since COVID. And these tools have enabled, one, new communities to assemble, sometimes virtually, sometimes from around the world, and new research questions have emerged to be investigated because of the new communities that have come together and said, hey, I never heard of that before, or why didn't I hear of that before, or you've omitted something very obvious. Why haven't you addressed this, that, or the other thing? Let's take a look briefly at what can be highlighted from a hand list like this. First, a digital hand list is a hand list of related images, not necessarily just maps. Maps can be used, but any kind of digitized image can be used as well, including scenes, for example, or drawings, or even into the photographic era, photographs. as well as space images, images from space relating to a particular area, like the Senegambia region. The whole point of putting a hand list together like this is to provide a kind of collective reference for everyone who gets together and thinks about these things collectively. We used to call these things, when they were written out in print, bibliographies or source material lists. Well, they're kind of webliographies at this point. Since they can be digitized, they can be shared as digital files, and there are possibilities of creating hyperlinks within digital files to other references on the internet available through web browsers. So it's for images and maps, collective images that can be distributed for collective reference to anybody who's joining the conversation in a map chat. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of a map chat to cluster together the insights of different peoples from different cultures, different communities, different language traditions, for example. It's usually undertaken by people who understand several languages and wish others to join in a conversation for languages they don't know about. This has been done at the BU African Studies Center, and in fact it serves as a kind of model for how it can be done anywhere. And it's been based on the work of Dr. Fallow Ngom. Dr. Fallow Ngom is from the anthropology department at BU, and he's an extraordinary researcher, touching upon not just anthropology, but all of the cultural history of this region of the Senegambia area in Africa. It's worth listening to a simple statement that he makes that, in effect, tripped off a whole series of research questions right away. For one thing, he's interested not just in language, social behavior, but in the history and the historical documentation available in things like historical maps. So he's drawn to the attention of the world that over time, cultures are interacting with one another along a whole range of frontiers, and the documentation from that often ends up in maps that can be studied in detail. So we'll look at this in a way that he would look at it and has invited us to look at it in detail. The oldest Portulan maps of the Portuguese, for example, of the Senegambia area are filled with coastal names. You can see it all along these old maps. Here's the Mediterranean up here. Here's Spain. Here's Portugal with the Portuguese flag implanted in it. And you can see as they drew these hand manuscript maps on vellum, that is on animal skins, they outlined both the terrestrial continental information and the islands, particularly the islands in the Atlantic, that were very important for the settlement history by Europeans who wanted to get around Africa to Asia for the Asian trade. The reason for this was motivated in part by the fall of Constantinople in 1453 and the control of the Mediterranean from then on in, the eastern portions of it certainly, by the Muslims. This made trade with the East very difficult and expensive. The King of Portugal and his son invested in new forms of navigation and state-sponsored exploration. Henry the Navigator sponsored, Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored the exploration efforts and rewarded ship's captains who came back with having mapped a certain distance along the coast of Africa. He gave them, in effect, cash incentives and basically subsidized the exploration of a circum-Africa route to the Indies. These early maps are absolutely fascinating for this reason, these Portulans, and they're so stuffed with information that we don't really know what most of it means now. Many of us have never learned medieval Portuguese. And some of these manuscripts have different kinds of languages that are being used at the time to create the place names. In fact, most of the place names, which are indicated in detail along this kind of map, especially down around Senegal, this is the Cape Verde region, including the island of Gore, right here. The Gambia River here, indicated, in fact labeled, and then down to Guinea-Bissau, or what we call Guinea-Bissau now, still under Portuguese cultural influence. All of the islands, the Cape Verde Islands here, are very well mapped and labeled, but many of us don't read medieval Portuguese or late medieval Portuguese and know what it means, let alone know the languages that are transcribed in the medieval Portuguese. That is, these are names of places that are referred to in many cases by local indigenous inhabitants. Portuguese began to transcribe the names that were being used by indigenous populations. But what is their meaning? What do they refer to? Well, at this point, we can only find out by looking at these maps in detail and trying to trace linguistically what they might mean in detail. Now that we can share this digitized image in detail across many language groups, we can have a much more complete understanding of what the meaning of the map was. Let's take a look at what Falun Gong himself summarized very quickly.
European explorers and travelers have visited West Africa from the 15th to the 17th century. In Senegambia, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French were among the first Europeans who set foot there.
Well, as you can see, Falun Gong realized that there were Portuguese, and then Dutch, and then British and French who interpreted what was going on the coast. In addition, there are a whole series of different African cultures which are being engaged in the exchange with Europeans on the coast in different periods, all of whom have languages of their own, some of which are transcribed in Arabic and recorded in documents in the Arabic script, which itself is not Arabic, but is the Arabic script representation of the local language. This is what Professor Ngom is a specialist in leading the research upon, and it's an international research team into the Ajami traditions of Muslim Africa. He studied case after case of this, looking at the ways in which Ajami sources, Ajami refers to the kind of transcription into the script being used by the transcription of Arabic, of local Muslim communities who were speaking other languages altogether, using Arabic as the way to transcribe what they were saying and recording for one another. Professor Falun Gong is the head of a research team looking into this, but by no means the only member of the research team. And in fact, it's crucial that the research team is able to share that kind of information across different platforms. So, he received, along with the others, a National Endowment for the Humanities Award for the Ajami Project, looking at the languages that were transcribed into various Arabic script traditions and record what local populations were experiencing, thinking, and writing about, exchanging information with one another. It's the encounter between the Ajami project and the cartographic project, that is, several cartographic projects, but the study of historical maps of this area, which can lead to extraordinary new insights about the meaning of maps at the time. Let's look briefly at these two components for potential collaborative research. First, the history and subject matter of Ajami studies, on the one hand, and then, on the other hand, some examples of the use of a digital hand list for potential map chats in Senegambian and African studies more generally. Some background notes on Ajami studies are appropriate. As we've indicated, Falun Gong is part of a large team now studying the significance of Ajami sources in Muslim Africa. This is not an insignificant portion of West Africa. In fact, when you include the Wolof, Fulani, Mandingo, and Hausa areas, all of which use Ajami scripts of one kind or another, there's a fairly large swath of area covered in West Africa using this kind of Ajami tradition. It's pretty amazing. It goes from Dakar itself and the Wolof around Dakar right through the Fouta Djallon area of Upper Guinea and partially touching upon Kankan region in Guinea and the headwaters of the Niger River itself, as well as moving on over through Bobo Dioulasso in Burkina Faso and Kong in northern Ivory Coast, in addition to Hausa land over in northern Nigeria. Let's look a little bit at the historical background then of Ajami studies to get a sense of how it has emerged as a field in recent years, reflecting an age-old practice and tradition within a wide range of African countries.
Islam first reached Africa in the 7th century during the Islamic conquest of North Africa. Provinces and nomadic peoples that were formerly under Roman rule were swiftly and violently absorbed into the Umayyad Caliphate, which stretched from Persia all the way to the Iberian Peninsula of Western Europe. Some of these conquered peoples were even practicing early forms of Christianity and writing in Latin script prior to their assimilation into this newly formed Islamic world. Prior to the Arabs and even the Romans, the people of this region had been in contact with numerous other cultures, including the Carthaginians, the Greeks, and the Phoenicians, and adopted their religions, cultures, and writing systems all the same. However, south of the Sahara, the story was quite different. The formation of the Sahara Desert presented a barrier to trade and exchange of ideas for much of human history. With that being said, peoples and civilizations south of the Sahara developed largely independently of those of the Mediterranean coast, which despite having their differences formed a relatively consistent tri-continental culture. From Egyptian hieroglyphics to Latin script, virtually all writing systems of this part of the world share a common ancestor. Largely due to isolation, however, the peoples south of the Sahara were almost exclusively illiterate. The Ge'ez script of Ethiopia is one exception to this rule. It is an indigenous sub-Saharan script that is historically linked by a common ancestor to other writing systems of the Nile Valley and the Mediterranean world. And CBD of southern Nigeria is another exception, and all evidence today points towards an independent invention by indigenous sub-Saharan African peoples. However, the remainder of Africa's literate civilizations almost exclusively used Arabic script for the majority of the continent's history. Unlike the case with North Africa, civilizations south of the Sahara were not forcibly conquered or converted by Arab invaders, and instead, largely converted peacefully. This was almost certainly due to economic reasons, as it took place primarily among the ruling elites, and with Islam being the single most prominent economic force in the medieval world. It incentivized conversion in addition to other benefits such as immunity to enslavement. Naturally, with the adoption of Islam, literacy was required. In order to be considered a Muslim, one must be able to read the Quran, which led to many civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa learning to read and write in the Abjad script throughout much of the Sahelian region of West Africa and the Swahili coast of East Africa. Despite this, the majority of the languages of sub-Saharan Africa were markedly different from Arabic. While the Arabic language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, most languages of Africa belong to the Niger-Congo family, which is fundamentally different from the former. Even Swahili, despite containing a plethora of Arabic words, it's still a Bantu language, a subgroup of the Niger-Congo language family. Abjad script is designed specifically for the Arabic language and thus is not completely compatible with the syntax or syllabary of most languages of sub-Saharan Africa. To remedy this, scholars developed modified versions of the Abjad that were more catered to suit the complex tonal systems and heavy vowel usage of African languages. This would have been crucial since Abjad traditionally contained no vowels, relying more on syllables of consonants to discern words, a concept that works very poorly with most African languages, which are heavily reliant on vowels and tones. Collectively, this modified version of the system is known as Ajami. Ajami derives from the word Ajami, which translates to foreigner in the Arabic language, and was initially used to describe the use of Abjad transcriptions on any non-Arabic language, but to present day it tends to refer more specifically to African languages. In the past, however, no Africans literate in the script would have referred to it as such. While Ajami has and remains very important throughout African history, works written in Arabic language tend to be more common for a multitude of reasons. Reason number one being the simple ease of use. Abjad script was designed from the ground up to transcribe the Arabic language, so naturally it is better suited for that purpose than any other language. Secondly, many 19th century Europeans specifically requested African scribes to write down their traditional poems and histories in Arabic, since it was easier for them to read. For example, traditionally, most Hausa writings were written in Ajami, usually in the Hausa or Fulfulde languages, and the minority being written in the Arabic language. It is also important to note that, like Arabic, Hausa also belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, thus it is probable that it is more compatible with the Abjad script. However, in these edited versions requested by Europeans, the Arabic language was always preferred. With that being said, most West Africa's pre-colonial written language and literature that was worthy of European preservation was written in Arabic, out of preference. Another interesting thing to note is that in the Hausa language, the analogous term for modified Latin script is boko. Lastly, in some regions of West Africa, Arabic was prevalent even in pre-colonial times, simply because it was just easier to work with. The famous Timbuktu manuscripts contain some examples of Ajami, but the common trend was to use the Arabic language for writing since it was simply just easier to do so, as well as there just being a more widely distributed population of people who understood the language. Hundreds of thousands of these manuscripts were written and traded in West Africa throughout history and were more valuable than gold. Despite this, many Europeans of pre-colonial times and modern times alike erroneously attribute this tradition of writing in Arabic as opposed to Ajami to backwardness or illiteracy. This viewpoint is so prevalent that many countries of West Africa have low literacy rates according to UNESCO, despite that not really being the case at all. For example, it is estimated that around 50% of Senegal's population is illiterate. In reality, this data only factors in its French-speaking population, with total disregard for the fact that it is estimated that over 80% of the population speaks Wolof, and most of them are able to read and write in Ajami, utilizing it to write down local languages for personal letters, religious purposes, and even business transactions. Similarly, an estimated 80% of the Hausa population of Nigeria can read and write in Ajami, but are officially considered illiterate by the Nigerian government, since Ajami is not taught in public school curricula. This is further exacerbated by the outright prohibition of the use of Arabic or its Ajami counterpart, and the writing down of anything secular, and lack of regulation or standardization for the usage of Ajami. Once more, however, it goes without saying that colonialism has done its number on the perception and usage of Abjad in Africa, and even more so in the uses of Ajami. Despite this, a respectable percentage of modern-day Africans still use Ajami, just as extensively as their ancestors did throughout the pre-colonial era. Or, as Professor Abdallah Uba Adamu, Professor of Science, Education, and Curriculum Studies at Kano's Bayero University puts it, if you go to Kano Curry Market in the heart of Kano City, you will find thousands and thousands of books written in Ajami. They are everywhere.
Now let's look briefly at the use of a digital hand list as the basis for a collaborative Senegambian historical map chat. We're looking here specifically at a digital hand list that's been created in a draft form for Dr. Fallow and Gome. And we're considering how that digital hand list can be used to promote a map chat, to launch it, to continue it, to serve as the basis, the kind of webliography for a map chat, an ongoing conversation between experts from a number of different fields. We can look at the map chat from the point of view of the hand list, the digital hand list that can be provided to all participants in a map chat well beforehand so that they can preview the things that will be discussed. Bring their own information to the map chat itself and expand the range of discussion. Typically, a hand list looks like a table where you have images and text, and the images are linked then directly to source materials in various libraries. Source material that's made available digitally by the library itself. The Stanford University Library has materials, for example. The Library of Congress has materials of great interest. And in fact, we can look at these in detail in a moment here. Let's start off with what, in fact, is one of the earliest representations of Portuguese portolan chart. This is preserved in the Afitera collection and is made available online for access to anyone who subscribes or signs up for free for the Afitera system. You can blow it up to a full screen size here, but more interestingly and more important for the study comparatively of different portions of the African coast is the ability to zoom in very closely to a level upon which you can actually read and discern the names of all of the not only coastal regions, which is what the Portolan charts were designed to detail, enabling navigators to know which port one after another could be found on a coast, but also the islands, given great detail. In fact, they're outsized. They're enormous in reference to the actual landmass they occupy in the middle of the ocean. But the Azores and the Madeiras and the Canary Islands and the Cape Verde Islands are given great attention here in this Portuguese portolan. But as you zoom in, you can see various aspects of the coastal region that are given quite some precision. And fortunately, with the zoom capacities now available, we can bring these into focus in a way that comparative cartography of this region is quite feasible and very productive. Here you have an indication, for example, the Portuguese flag being dominant in this area of what's referred to as Capo Verde, C for Capo Verde, as well as down here in the Gambia River, and further south and along the coast, an interesting set of islands in what we now know as Guinea-Bissau, colored differently, greens and reds, just as there's a difference in the greens and reds in the islands out in the Capo Verde area off the coast, the Cape Verde Islands. There are rich collections of Cape Verde maps in the Boston Public Library that have yet to be examined by the Leventhal Map Collection, but these can be brought into focus along with those maps available in places like Afroterra, like these. Now, the Portuguese were noted by Fado and Gomes as the first in the area, but there are other mapping traditions that need to be looked at in detail. Fado and Gomes mentioned the Portuguese as an important presence in early European contact with the Senegambia region, and it's clear from these Portulan maps that that's the case. But we can also look at other traditions. As he mentioned, the Dutch and the French, and we know as well the English, become very interested groups in this area. So we can look back at some of these things and in fact trace their importance in other entries in the map hand list. In fact, the Dutch provide a great deal of detail, including prints that are very interesting. If you look at some of the prints that are, again, preserved in the Afroterra collection, you can see what these forts on a place like the island of Gore were said to look like at the time. Take a look. You can zoom in on the detail of a fort up here on the top. Well, it was referred to as Fort Saint-Michel in later years by the French. But this one is in fact Fort Nassau, given a Dutch name, on the Ile de Gore. Now this is in Dutch because it's a Dutch map maker. Gives details right down to the importance of a dog. Now this is not a photograph, and it's not clear what the dog is doing there. It is clear that the dogs introduced on islands do something very interesting. They usually devastate any local populations of animals, but they also can be used as guard dogs and what are referred to nowadays as junkyard dogs, that is, dogs that can be trained to be quite vicious and control populations very quickly. So the presence of a dog is not here a photograph, but it is iconographic, indicating it's another aspect of power of those in charge on this island of Gore. But you can see that there's a great deal of interest in other kinds of things as well. And if you go back to the original maps here and their entry, you can go out to other areas of the hand list to find a great deal out about this whole region. On the maps that the Dutch made, in this particular case, the map of the region that's represented in a very interesting print, which is disorienting to many of us who haven't seen these things to begin with, because we're used to seeing north as straight up and west over to the left of the map and right of the map would be east. But in fact, that's not the representation in early maps, especially in the Dutch tradition in many parts of the world. Here you can get the northern orientation, but it's down here and it's off to the left. So you'd have to turn this map around in a sense, and you can rotate it like that if you wished to see what it would look like if it were in a more customary north-south tradition. There, the outlines of Cape Verde are very distinct, and the river Senegal is indicated to the interior, and the river the Gambia here. But let's look at it from this point of view to know a couple things. First of all, the charting of the coast is very important. The naming of places along the coast is important. The naming of the places along the rivers is absolutely crucial. And the representation of the iconography in the cartouche, this is what's referred to as the cartouche, is quite important as well. Let's take a look at it. You might not realize that this is Senegal. The Dutch refer to it here as Genoa, not Senegal. It's also important to remember and in fact note in detail that this is not a photograph. We do not know. We have no understanding of whether or not this is actually occurring on the island or the areas on the land right next to the Cape Verde Islands, or whether it's merely a representation on the part of someone who's never been there. The map makers had not been, for the most part, to West Africa. And what they're representing in the cartouche in particular are scenes that are iconographic, not photographic, iconographic. The icons being represented here are indigenous populations which are wearing feathers in this case. A very interesting problem in early European cartography. Indigenous populations, ever since the discovery of the Americas, where feather headdresses were dominant, are represented in other parts of the world as having feathers. That is, indigenous populations may not have used feathers, but they became an icon for the indigenous population. Furthermore, we don't know if in this part of the Senegambia region there were any elephants at the time, and we don't know to what extent the gold trade took this form. But it's a very precise representation, even if it may not be a very accurate one, of what's going on between the Cabo Blanco, as it said, and the Cabo Verde, the Mauritania region and the northern Senegal region. This is something that was presented in Amsterdam, and the details of the gold weighing is very interesting. You can see the trader here is holding a balance and showing the indigenous expert here how to weigh out gold at the time. Well, it's doubtful that this was ever something that happened historically, but it's represented on a map, and very important to keep an eye on the cartouche, as in a sense it has a separate history, the history of the iconography of African populations. So the Dutch presence is amply represented in this hand list, but so are more recent traditions, particularly the French and the English. And it's important to get an idea of some of these more recently, especially as the slave trade went on. And we can zoom in on these as well by asking for a full-scale map and an enlargement as we zoom in to various parts of the Senegal River, for example. Now, this is actually a very interesting detailed map of a number of things, including the names of places along the Senegal River from its mouth down here at Saint Louis, right all the way up through a whole series of towns, villages, cities, and what are referred to in this French map of Royaume des Foulées, or Foula, Royaume de Burba Wolof, Pays des Wolof, Cayor, ou du Damel. Well, very interesting notion here. We've got indication of kingdoms and also indication of countries, as well as place names, along a precise, if not geographically precise, at least sequentially precise, series of stages along a river, which, if you go up the river for quite a while to the Galam region, you can learn a number of things that are quite interesting, especially if drawn in detail. You can see, for example, that there are a number of rocks or waterfalls that are indicated. And there are various precise names. Now, these are the ones that can be checked out with local populations to this day, especially in the Ajami tradition. But a couple of the names stick out, like this F. Saint Joseph. The Fa stood for at the time the Fort of Saint Joseph's. Well, that's not a local name, and yet it's way the heck up here in what are said to be either bounded areas or countries or regions, and all of which is part of Galam. Fort Saint-Joseph. Well, what's the Fort Saint-Joseph doing this far up the Senegal River? Well, that's quite a ways inland, more to the interior than any other European had penetrated Africa at the time of making this map. And it's important to look at the historical context of that. To do that, you can look at other maps in the hand list, not necessarily in the tradition of the Afroterra Library or the Library of Congress, but say, for example, the Northwestern University Library. Actually, the Library of Congress has some very interesting maps that take up that theme we were looking at earlier. The course of the river of Senegal, or Senegal. Now, their magnification tradition is a bit different, but it's very fruitful and quite useful. And you're looking at a map here that's hard to understand visually on that level, but you can ask to see it in a full screen, and you see it's divided into two parts. If you start to zoom in on this, you can see once again the course of the Senegal River that is been charted by an ingénieur, Francois, that is a French engineer, from the beginning of the river, the mouth of the river, to Bilbas, the island of Bilbas. Well, you can trace that up as we were on the previous map, sort of station by station, town by town, up to what's referred to as the Ile de Bilbas. And you can then see the continuation of that map, because it was so long it couldn't be fit on one span, from the Ile Bilbas up to the Roche de Govina. Rocher de Govina is in fact the falls. And if you follow the river up to the falls, which are represented over here, the cataracts, some would call them, the Rocher de Govina. If you come downriver here, what do we see again? Wow, we see an indication of the Fort Saint-Joseph. Well, there it is, in all its splendor, located, not an African name, Fort Saint-Joseph, on the south side of the Senegal River. Now, that's a very important map in the indication of the history of this region. If we return to the hand list, we can see that further on down, the Stanford University Library has made available a very interesting and related map. They put it together in an exhibit a while back called Maps of Africa, an online exhibit. And they were generous enough to put these images up online. As it turns out, These images are very related to the ones we were just looking at the Upper Senegal. Take a look here. We'll fit the full screen on it and look at, again, a two-part map. But in this case, it's not just two parts. It has an extraordinary array of different information inserted in each of the two parts. Familiar is the movement up the river with the place names all the way past the island of Bilbao to, in effect, the cataracts and the region of Galam. In the region of Galam, you can see the familiar Fort Saint-Joseph indicated in this area. And moreover, there's some detail given about that fort in the insert. The insert is right here. This is a fascinating insert because it gives in detail what's involved in this fort, complete with labels. The entrance to the fort, the court, the magasin or storage spaces, the passages, and the slave booths, indicating that there were slave booths in E, C, 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 and you can see that in fact the slave booths are on the side, the outside here. The entrances are very constrained, and one door only to the outside. These are indications of military installations. Basically, a cannon is able to be pointed out from that region and maneuvered to some extent on the inside. The stairs go up to the roof. It's not clear whether the cannons are on the roof or what other kind of armaments are up there, but it's a very detailed plan of a particular fort found hundreds of kilometers to the interior, and we're given this very interesting piece of information in the cartouche here. The general map of the river Senegal, well, this is now in English, right? From the falls of Govina, and we've seen those in other maps as well, to the ocean, taken by a French engineer in 1718 and drawn by, this is very interesting, Seigneur d'Anville, from particular drafts by and published by Labat. Now, particular drafts by d'Anville are very interesting because d'Anville is a major French cartographer of the 18th century. In fact, he had an appointment to the king. And so the details given on these maps, copied by the English, clearly indicating their position in different inserts in reference to villages, towns, and the like, and the river itself, and then the inserted maps down below of the mouth of the river with the island of Saint Louis and an English island indicated just to the south. Here the river is flowing from the north to the south, so the orientation of the map has to be taken into account. But the English are present, and that's why they've started to copy the maps of the French and produce them for their own navigators and potentially their own settlers. Indication of details like this are quite important as well. Salt ponds. Those interested in the provisioning of the slave trade know that salt ponds are very crucial for the study of what's going on here. There's further detail about the island of Gorée. This is fascinating detail because it indicates that there's a fresh water source, a little marigot as they call it in French, and an outline of the fort at Saint Louis, as well as habitations and potentially different representations, either a graveyard, we're not clear here, or perhaps a garden, but an indication of a church of some kind here. Now, all of these details can be looked at with great interest by people interested in the history of Senegal and the Senegambian region. So we can, in a sense, pursue this map by map through the guide, but you get the idea. The more contemporary maps are even more detailed, as you'd expect, and can be brought up to recent times very clearly with things like these maps of the region, which again can be blown up and looked at in extraordinary detail. In this case, representing most of the Sahara and a great number of the trade routes that came across the Sahara to this whole region of what's being referred to here as the Bambara, what we know as the Niger River, and what by this time had become an area of French interest, all up and down the Senegal River and the Gambia River here, French controlling both what's north and what's south of the Gambia by the time that this is indicated in the late 19th century. So these maps can be studied in detail and should be taken quite seriously for those interested in African history. So this is what a map chat can consist of: experts talking about these maps, sharing them through a digital hand list like this, and analyzing their particular features in very powerful ways, including especially their annotations on the maps and the indications of a new kind of iconography, that is, representation of Africa in images, some of which is quite fantastic in its representation. In this case, we have an English cartographer, Jeffries, who's basically copying the maps of the Senegambia from the French, and copying as well, as we shall see, the iconography of the French, including a woman here who's represented with a hand on a lion and wearing a very strange headgear, which is kind of reduced in size, but an elephant is the indication here, an elephant of some kind, and holding a cornucopia of goods with a camel in the background and a pyramid. Well, pyramids are nowhere near Senegambia area, and it's not known whether either crocodiles or ostriches were present, but obelisks were not. And this kind of fanciful hair and hat routine is very strange and quite interesting to start looking at in terms of the iconography of African representations on European maps. Well, you get the idea. There are various kinds of things possible in the study of these things, and it's important to look at them in detail and go back, in a sense, to call these up from the different collections. In this case, we can go back through the hand list and go map by map, collection by collection, and start conversations on areas of great interest to those in the Senegambia region. These then are two components for fruitful future research: the NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities Ajami Project on the one hand, plus future digital map chats in African history, focusing on historical resources not previously brought into focus because we didn't have the technology, but now that we do, we have new communities that can pose new questions. The digital hand list can launch and support this future collaborative research. It's important to notice that there's a lot more involved than merely correcting place names on old European maps. In fact, consider this problem. a very interesting region of this map. What's the problem? Well, there are place name problems, obviously, but there's also a conceptual problem. This map represents the linking of the Senegambia area to what involves an internal river flowing to or from lakes, not clear which. Furthermore, it links both the Gambian River and the Senegal River, and rivers in what we now know as Guinea-Bissau. Very strange map in many respects, and often sort of laughed at by historians of West Africa as an example of a big mistake. Historical maps like these have a new meaning when they are studied by a new community of scholars. We can ask the question, for example, is this mistake on this map a classical example of misinformed European cartography, confusing one river system with another and linking it to a third, and not making it very clear whether it's flowing east or west? Very interesting problem in conceptual history. Well, perhaps it's not a map of physical phenomena, but of sociological, historical, and literary phenomena. We can ask then, is this a mistake, a classic example of misinformed European cartography, or is this, in fact, an old map of a newly understood reality? A whole region, the Ajami region, where Arabic script is being used to transcribe local languages. It'd be interesting to trace this down because, in effect, European cartographic understanding is a transcription into European languages of many things that are talked about in local languages. Now, if the local languages of the Ajami tradition spoke of a geography that of continuous networks along internal rivers, that itself is mapped here in translation in these European maps. Now, what's involved is more than just getting the names straight, but getting the whole conceptual idea of a related world straight. This is where these old maps are of immense interest to those studying African history. Not just European cartographic history, but African history. This region is, in fact, something that needs to be studied in detail for its cartographic history, yes, but also for its integrated social, economic, and political history. In this sense, the collaborative research is important for both global historical cartography and African history itself. Well, if you can get detailed maps of islands like the Gorée Island here, for example, and combine those with an understanding of the languages being spoken in the area and being transcribed in the various maps with place names and the like, you can see how Falun Gong and his associates in the Ajami project, historians like David Robinson, for example, who have long spent the whole career studying the kingdoms along the Senegalese River, you can see how this leads to a new kind of scholarship. They can share selected maps with one another in a hand list. Everyone can look at them collectively even before they gather in a Zoom session. Places like the Boston University African Studies Center can convene conferences or lectures or insights of one or another individual members of this large team from the Ajami project, and they can combine them and represent them to the rest of the African Studies community through groups like the Africa Map Circle. So, You can see that in the future a map chat with Professor Ngom plus the members of the Ajami Research Group could make an extraordinarily valuable contribution to African and cultural studies of various kinds, African studies of culture, of language, and of history throughout a whole range of different countries that we now know in and around the Senegambian area. In effect, we have new technologies that are enabling new communities to assemble virtually, if not in conferences physically, and they lead to new questions, giving us all an enriched understanding of African historical cartography, African cultural evolution, and African history. Thank you very much.